Welcome everyone to Tradecast, being beamed to the world from the offices of Belia Trading in Lima, Peru. My name is Manolo Delgado. I'm the Corporate Director of Marketing at Belia Trading, and we have a very special episode today. If this is the first time you join us, let me just remind you what is Tradecast. Tradecast is a series of interviews with global executives from all around the world, really top people, in which we will discuss many things related to trade and international business. Just to give you some examples, we would talk about manufacturing, product development, global sourcing, quality control, logistics, free trade zones, international trade law, negotiations in trade, entrepreneurship, sustainability, and many more. We have confirmed guests from, as I said, all over the world, from Japan to Sri Lanka, India, Vietnam, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, Brazil, Peru, the USA, and many, many more. So if this is the first time you join us, let me remind you of the structure. We would first talk to our guests about their career and their life, because we believe that they are role models, and I think it's interesting for you to get to know their experience. Then we will talk a bit more about the place they work, their company or the institution, organization that they work at. And then we will go into the subject matter and talk about the present and the future, which of course will be in a way mixed because, well, that's the state of affairs. And we will finish, and this is super important, I urge you to stay until the end, with this famous questionnaire by French journalist Bernard Kuiten. And excuse my French, but it's the name, it's Apostrophe au bouillon de culture, or something like that. It's a fun questionnaire, and I think you will enjoy it at the end. So please stay and watch it with us. One quick disclaimer, our guests speak on their behalf. They're expressing their own opinions, not necessarily the ones of the companies or organizations that they work for. Before we start and I introduce our great guest today, let me give you, as we always do, a trade fact. Gantt, that was the origin of WTO, has expanded into WTO and now currently has 164 member countries. And WTO has settled in their dispute settlement role 616 cases between countries. So, without further ado, as they say, let me introduce Mr. Bernard Kuiten. He's the head of External Relations at the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Bernie, I'm going to call you because we've worked together, and if you don't mind, I'll make it more familiar. How are you, Bernie? Everything okay? How is it, Geneva?
I'm very fine, and please do call me Bernie, because Bernard, my mother calls me Bernard. Everybody else calls me Bernie. And everything's fine here, we have a first day of sun after, a very cold period of time, and we can use some sun, we can use some sun in general, weather-wise, but also more broadly, globally, a bit of light is good in these days. So yeah, everything is fine.
Good. Thank you for being here. I appreciate your time. As I said, Bernie, let's talk first a little bit about you, okay? Many of our viewers are people that are maybe university students, maybe doing their master's degrees, interested in international trade, not only necessarily in WTO law, but international trade and business in a broader idea of the word. And sometimes people do forget that WTO plays a role in the private sector, very much so. People don't really grasp this that much, and WTO seems to be kind of a hazy concept, a hazy institution. So one thing that we will try to do today is understand it better for the benefit of people that are already in business and the private sector too. So let's go down to the basics. Where were you born? What did you study? Tell us a little bit about the beginnings of your career.
Sure. And thanks again, Mao, for having me. It's great to see you, even if it's virtual and even if it's in an interview. Listen, I was born in the Netherlands. You can probably hear that in my accent still, in a small village, near Eindhoven. I always say I'm a Philips child, for those who know the company. My father used to work there. They helped me with my studies. So I'm very much from that region. And I also studied in that particular part of the Netherlands. I studied economics. I studied international economics and specifically development economics because that was something that interested me. Nothing of an ideology or drive, it's just something that interested me a lot. And anecdotally, given the fact that I've been working in trade for more than 30 years, I think the only attention paid during my studies to trade was maybe, 2 chapters in a textbook on UNCTAD. At that point in time, nobody talked about the GATT. Of course, I'm an old man, so it wasn't WTO yet. There was 2 chapters talked about UNCTAD, and that's it. So if you ask me, how did I get into trade, or how did I get professionally working on trade? I absolutely don't know. I applied for a job, which I found interesting because it sounded interesting, international trade, economics. There was a relationship with development. And I got into it when I started working for the government.
So you went straight from university into the Dutch government.
Yeah, 8 weeks in between in the army. We still were obliged to go into the army as men. These days it was only men. I got out of it very early, but then I started working for the government, yes.
And where you went into the trade ministry, or where was it, and what did you do in the government?
It's the economics ministry. The Dutch don't have a specific ministry, interestingly, for countries so dependent on trade, but they have a Ministry of Economic Affairs. And within there, they have a part that focuses on international relations and on trade, again, given the importance of trade for a country like the Netherlands. That's why I started to enter into the world of international trade talks and deals and relations.
So from the get-go, you started working in relation to other countries. At that time, what year is this? Was WTO present already? This would be, WTO was 1995, I believe. So it was more like bilateral trade agreements, EU stuff.
No, it was actually, I started working in 1990. And back then, they were negotiating the establishment of the World Trade Organization. This was called the Uruguay round. They negotiate, in long rounds where they talk about everything and anything. This was the first one, because before you went to the GATT, there was an agreement between countries. But people wanted an international organization that would deal with trade relations between its members, between nations. And they were negotiating that. So I stepped into that and started working on small files first, spent a lot of time, for example, in Brussels, with other member states of the European Union, because the European Union has the authority and competence to talk about trade for the Union. It's not individual EU member state. So that's how I started my career, bit by bit, small areas, but yes, focused on trade. No WTO yet. I saw the establishment during the first, 5 to 8 years of my career, which was very interesting, very special.
I'm sure. And when did you make the move from Brussels, mostly Brussels center, to Geneva, and the origins, I guess, of WTO? You must have started when WTO was just about to be formed, or had just been formed. How did that came to be?
I moved from The Hague in the Netherlands, from the government to the European Commission in Brussels, started working for them for a couple of years. And then there was a request from the Dutch to join their, permanent mission, their kind of embassy in Geneva, to work on trade matters. That's when I moved to Geneva. I became a diplomat for a while. And that was I have to say this correctly, in 1997. So this was after the establishment of the WTO, but in the very early years. And so I got to see, from different perspectives, from a national perspective, from a regional perspective, and then from an international perspective, what it was that people tried to do with this organization, which was highly ambitious, totally new, because people never had anything at that scale and that level. I think we had 120 members when the WTO was established in 1995. So, it's always interesting to see an initiative or an idea come to fruition and then kick off and start. What is also interesting to see in that perspective, and that's relevant also for today's work, is that one starts with high expectations and high ambitions. And in any international arena and environment, you slowly have to sort of calm down a little bit, because it's always more difficult. If you and I need to agree on something, it's easy. If you add another 5 people, it's become more difficult. If you add another 80 and they all have to agree, you can imagine, it got slower and slower and slower. So it's very interesting to see ambition and purpose, becoming more realistic over time. But I did see the beginning. Yeah, I saw the negotiations as a young man. And then I saw the establishment in the first years of the World Trade Organization.
That must have been very, very interesting. And I'd love to talk a bit more in a minute about how WTO became to be and a bit of the history of it briefly. But I'm just curious before we leave the part that we focus on you, because you started in your own government, then you went to the multilateral system. What would you say is the main difference in terms of let's say leadership? I'm curious about how both worlds operate and how you perceive the main difference between being focused in the interests of one country, you know, and your team all focused in the same, to this, as you mentioned, very, very cumbersome process of dealing with so many varied interests and still try to achieve something. Does that really change the way you operate, the strategy you use on achieving your goals?
Well, I mean, the most important thing is you learn if you move from, you know, a one-dimensional national responsibility to a plurilateral, which is a couple, and then a multilateral discipline or responsibility. It's very important because you learn what it is and you learn how to see where people come from. If you're a national, you know, if you represent a national interest, it's probably like a company, you know, if you operate in one or two countries only, you know, you have certain areas where you need to develop or you need to move forward. If you're a multinational, you operate in 120 countries, you're covering multiple areas. So you need to, on the one hand, be very international in your thinking, but at the same time also understand where things come from. This is what always helped me in my job, because I came from the national level. So I know how negotiators come in. They have a very, I wouldn't say narrow, but they have, you know, a couple of things that they want to get. If you then are responsible for more things, you need to be able to aware of the compromises. Whereas at the national level, you often come in, that's what I want, that's my mandate, that's my instruction. I have to go back and report that I got it or I didn't. So you become more compromise oriented and you come to a better understanding why things can be so different and sometimes so difficult to match. That's what I've learned and I still try to apply in my current work.
Sure. Great. We touched briefly on the origins of WTO, and I agree with you. It's almost shocking that I don't know, students, even at the level of high school, are not more aware of trade as just as an idea and how trade brings development, brings peace, right? This famous phrase of you don't fight people that you trade with, and how civilizations have flourished basically by trade, you know. So WTO, I would argue, is one of the most important organizations, international organizations out there, which some of them are, you know, and we will talk about this later, a bit challenged today, and what do they actually do for the world. But let's go back to the early 90s, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember this started with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, right? Which is the first start of countries deciding, okay, guys, we've had 2 wars, and you know we need to find a way to negotiate in an open way so that we avoid more problems related to the economic fact of scarce resources for infinite needs, in a way, right? So tell us, as if we knew nothing, and WTO is completely new to us. What is the role of WTO? Why did it came to be? And as you said, which countries had the first impulse to make it happen?
Well, I mean, you said it yourself. I mean, this came after 2 world wars. That the devastation and incredible economic crisis and loss, let alone human and societal losses. And, you know, back then people, you know, post 1945 said, we should probably try to work together instead of fight. And it sounds simple, but it was as simple as that. You know, can we not find ways to cooperate, to reintegrate, to bring people on board, to bring other countries on board, and work together to move away, to reestablish, you know, economic progress. And that's back in 1948 when the idea was to have, you know, a World Bank, an International Monetary Fund, and an International Trade Organization. This was in Havana, Cuba, where they thought, with I think 28 countries, to establish that organization. For reasons I won't go into, they couldn't make it work. And instead said, okay, we do at least need to sort of create some agreement amongst each other to move forward on trade. Because the argument was economic efficiency comes from trade cooperation, not from trade restriction or protectionism. So why don't we start trying to get onto agreement? This was only related to goods, it wasn't related to services. I wasn't related to intellectual property. The idea was to sort of, how can we smoothen trade amongst the countries? That went for a long time. It expanded. More and more people signed on to this GATT, this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. But then the realization was, but this is too narrow. We don't cover agriculture. We don't cover services. We need a framework in which we can actually cooperate independently as an international organization, with support from the Secretary. That's when people started thinking, maybe we should create the International Trade Organization, the World Trade Organization. I mean, that was in the 80s. So you moved from 1948 to the 80s. It took a long time. And the reason for that is very, very simple. And this is also what WTO is all about. This organization covers and tries to cover, it doesn't cover everything. It tries to cover, trade relations between its members. But it doesn't do that on a voluntary basis. This is not kind of a best endeavor. It literally is based on negotiations. It's literally based on what countries are ready. Because maybe I should go back there, is the idea that this is all about trade liberalization is first and foremost not true. The idea was to create stability and predictability, particularly for those who trade. And given that policy is set by governments, had to be an international, intergovernmental organization. And people quickly came to realization, okay, but if we do that, and if this is binding upon us, which is, as I said, not the best endeavor, we're going to have to negotiate. I'm not just going to give up, as they saw it back then, or give in to demands from others. Everybody wants to get into your market, sell their products or services, in the best way possible, with no restrictions, with no tariffs, with no regulations that discriminate. Because that's another famous and an important pillar of this organization, is that you cannot discriminate. The idea, again, you work for a company. Imagine you would not know what you're entering into if you start expanding into other countries. Every country has its own rules, has its own regulation. They treat your competitor better, depending on the country you are. The idea is to create this predictability so that you don't have to think of it. I often compare the organization with, an ABS system in a car, in planes. Everybody knows in every car, every modern car has ABS. Now, it helps you braking. It helps you avoiding slipping off the road. Nobody asks about it. Nobody even questions it. Everybody knows it's there. But if you take it out and you come onto a wet road and you take a corner and you brake and you slip off, you slip off the road into a valley or a ravine, whatever. That's what WTO does. Many people don't know it because they don't need to know it. It's
Sure.
there. Make sure that you are aware, that you are covered, that you know what you're up to when you trade, like your company.
That's super important because, as you said, most people would imagine, well, I don't have a specific number, but that the whole purpose of WTO is to promote free trade, which may be, okay, as a means through negotiation, that is something that happens. But you're saying that it's actually to provide stability and predictability in the system where all the countries, and this is a particularity, I think, at WTO, that all the current 163 members, if I'm not wrong, have to agree. That's why what you guys call the rounds take so long, right? We're still in Doha round that started in 2001. Am I right? Well, if you guys still call it that way.
People don't really refer to it anymore because it was a round that was started but never really finished. So it's not that it stopped. And more importantly, I think some of the elements that people were talking about, and development was one, are still very, very vivid or very much alive and focused on. It's just not referred to as Doha round anymore.
Sure.
But I think again, the importance here is that, and this is actually when the founding mothers and fathers of the organization, when they negotiated and established it in 95, in the preamble, it says clearly that the WTO is not there to sort of like make sure that companies make more money. It's not there to make sure that, you know, investors actually do better. No, it's actually there to try to support people in their lives, in their progress. It's trying to, you know, support, it literally says so, you know, support countries in their development, in their sustainable development. Imagine back in 95, the word sustainability was already there. Now, that's easier said than done. Let's be very honest, you know,
Sure.
I mean, because the bottom line still is that, you know, I don't have the book here with me. We have you know, a rule book that applies to all members, to all trade, which is like 600-700 pages. And then we have countries, members of WTO, that have made commitments to either, or to mostly create stability. And you know, if the import of pens, you know, into Switzerland have a tariff of 5%, that means that tariff is bound under WTO rules. Every exporter of pens to Switzerland faces the same tariff. If that tariff would not be bound, then Switzerland would have the possibility to say, well, I give that particular company, you know, a tariff of 2%, and the other company a tariff of 10%. What does it create? It's not fair. It's unfair competition. It doesn't create the efficiency that you look, and that's why the free trade or the trade liberalization idea comes behind. You know, if trade can flow freer, it's more efficient. But the ultimate goal, despite the criticism that we faced in the past of WTO, is not necessarily trade liberalization. It's stability, predictability, and support of progress and development of economies.
Sure, and you're touching, and I want to go a bit deeper to explain those two principles which you kind of touched upon, which are MFN, most favored nation, and national treatment. I think those are the two pillars, I guess, on which WTO precisely provides stability. Could you please explain to us MFN and national treatment?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is MFN is a typical trade geek term, you know, the ones who work in the trade arena or in trade, they know what it means. Anybody outside looks at you like, well, MFN, national treatment, and they are the basic principles of the organization. It comes back to what I just said. It tries to avoid that there is discrimination. So, I mean, if you would represent your country, you would get a certain treatment under WTO rules that would be given to all other members of the WTO. Again, it would make your job easier as an entrepreneur because you know what you're up to. National treatment almost goes a step further. It means that, you know, at the national level, there can't be discrimination. It can't be that, you know, you actually promote or support in any kind of way your national producers of whatever it is better than their international competitors that are on the market. Now, those are the basic principles. Let's also be very realistic and honest. You know, there are exceptions to it. You know, I always say this, you know, and for everybody listening or later on, you know, the rules that the WTO has, the negotiated outcomes that individual countries, you know, were committed to, and they're bound by it. Huh? They're bound by it under WTO. They were negotiated by a mix of economists, lawyers, and politicians. So you
Nice
can
bunch.
imagine, yeah. So you can imagine that, you know, the agreements and the rules that we have don't say like, okay, the light is green, you can cross the road. Yes, I know. How many people cross the road when the light is red? Multiple people. That happens in trade and under trade and WTO rules too. Not everybody abides by it. Some agreements have exceptions because people negotiated them. What we try to do, you know, here in Geneva, what this organization is trying to do, is to create as much clarity as possible on the basis of these rules and on the basis of these agreements. Perfect agreements, probably my legal colleagues would disagree, they don't exist. Perfect agreements don't exist, not in the international world, because there's always someone, there's always a country that says like, I can't fully commit to that, or I need an exception. We have a lot of flexibilities and exceptions for developing countries, members, at least developed countries, but that's for a good reason. Why? Because they, you know, they may need more time, they may need more space, and more flexibility to implement or live up to certain rules. But that's with a purpose, you know.
Yeah, I think it's that one of them, the enabling clause. I seem to remember from back in my day. But okay, that's super important. I want to go. One of the main you can break these two principles that we discussed, MFN and national treatment, legally within the ample array of exceptions that are written in the treatments. The most obvious and I guess used example is free trade agreements, right? FTAs, where basically I give certain countries with which I have an FTA the different conditions that to the other members of the club. And I remember when we worked together 16 years ago, this famous, I think it was an economist, Jagdish Bhagwati, would talk about the spaghetti bowl, this very complex array of Mercosur and ASEAN countries, and what used to be NAFTA. Now I think after Trump got a different name. But how does WTO deal with that? Because one could argue that, well, these actual principles have so many ways to break them, that what is the purpose? How does WTO respond to a criticism like that?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say about any free trade agreement, whether with one country or with more countries, is, and this is a school of thought I believe, and not everybody does, is it actually are great testing grounds for new ideas. It's far easier to negotiate new rules that don't exist yet. For example, on electronic commerce with your neighbor, because in principle, you know your neighbor well, you probably have a trustworthy relationship in most cases, not everywhere, but in most cases. So you can go a little further than what we have at WTO. So you can all do it bilaterally. First and foremost, the big difference there is that, if you bring something that is tested at bilateral level in free trade agreements to a multilateral level at WTO, we have a different kind of system because it's binding on everyone and we can enforce it. And often with bilateral free trade agreements, the enforcement is a bit of an issue. How do you make sure, say you and I negotiate an agreement and I violate some of the things I committed to, how are you going to enforce it? There's nowhere you can go, in principle. You can speak to me, you can make it public, you can embarrass me, but I can still deviate from it. At WTO, that's not possible. Now, the conflict that you have between all these free trade agreements, and I think since about 5 years or 4 years, every member of the WTO is in one way or another involved in a bilateral or plurilateral trade agreement. It goes into the 500s, and they have to notify them to WTO. We know about them. Sometimes they conflict with some of our rules. The most important problem is a pragmatic problem, nothing to do with WTO, is that's where the spaghetti bowl argument comes in from Professor Bhagwati, is that it's not an issue necessarily for a big multinational to figure out, what the trade advantages are based on bilateral agreements, based on WTO rules, because they have the departments and the outfits. The problem lies with the micro, small, and medium enterprises. They don't have the people. How are they, if they want to expand? These days, with electronic commerce, with virtual trading, environment, it's much easier to expand. But what if you don't know what you're stepping into? What if you find out, okay, under WTO rules, my service can be provided without restraint, but then it turns out there's a bilateral agreement which says something different. Now, if you don't have the people to find out, you have a problem. That's where I think the conflict comes in terms of information, transparency, and there's no answer to it, because we would, of course, argue the best thing to do is to regulate and negotiate everything under WTO, because then that what you're up to. You have one rule that applies to everybody. I'm simplifying, but that's what it basically is. But that's not how the world works, because again, 164 members getting an agreement, we decide by consensus. And for those who don't get the consensus principle, which I fully understand, it literally means that no matter the size of the country, no matter the size of the economy, at WTO, each member has one voice, one vote. And if one member says, I disagree with what's coming to the table, you have to go back to the negotiating table. That's why it takes so long. It's very democratic, but that's why it takes so long to actually come to any kind of conclusion. So
democratic to a fault, some would say, but it's a fair system, right? That's the whole point.
Fair system. It's a very fair system. But imagine you are a trade negotiator for a particular country, and you work for the Minister for Trade, and the Minister for Trade wants to have results because they want to expand the economy, they want to have access for their e-commerce providers, whatsoever. It doesn't matter. Now, okay, I can get a deal done with my neighbor in a year, or I can get an agreement at WTO in 5 years. You're a politician. What would you choose? Well, the politician will say, I need that deal now. So you go for the bilateral deal. It's easy.
Sure.
The WTO comes often, at a later stage. But bear in mind, this is something that we tell, or I tell at least, when I do lectures or presentations, is under WTO, whatever you sign on to, whatever you agree to is binding. It's not like you can change it or you can walk away from it. If you do, you may face a dispute, and I think we're going to talk about that maybe. It's binding. So for a government to decide to sign on to something under the organization's rules and disciplines, you need to take time. You need to carefully consider. It's an advice that we actually do and that we actually give to people. Take your time. So when we speak, my responsibilities also include relationship with the private sector. And the private sector says the same thing. We want results now. This is taking too long. I said, yes, it's taking too long. You have to give us some time. You have to give these governments some time to negotiate, because the end result, is a step forward in terms of predictability and transparency for you doing business. Now, on the longer run, you say 10, 15 years, you may have the perfect agreement, although perfect agreement doesn't exist, as I said earlier. But you're going to have to give it time. If in the meantime you do something bilaterally in the government, fine. Nobody says you can't do it. But you have to balance patience with longer term predictability and immediate needs. And that's a challenge, I can tell you. If I were a government, if I were an advisor to a government, longer term stability, short term gains.
Yeah, that tends to be a problem for any government, right? Yes. I need to stay in power. I need to take short-term actions. It is a tricky balance. But you mentioned something that it's quite unique to WTO, and I'd like to spend maybe a couple of minutes just for people to benefit from your knowledge regarding dispute settlement, because IOs, international organizations, tend to not have a way to actually change government's policies with a specific ruling, which is quite unique in WTO. The fact that an international organization, after going through a process, of course, can quote unquote force, and maybe you can explain that how this force comes to be, can actually, if a country sets a policy that is actually breaking the rule, and another country brings a case against it, there is a process called dispute settlement that can end up with a ruling in which W says to the country, you need to change this policy, blah, 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 blah. How does that work in terms of the practicality of it, if it really happens a lot? I know it does take quite a bit of time, understandably, but maybe you can explain a little bit more about that characteristic of WTO, dispute settlement.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first, correct you a little bit there, use the word force. It's better to use the word enforce, because it's not that someone forces anything upon someone else, WTO, one member towards another. What this dispute settlement system allows you to do is to enforce the commitments that, again, if I see a 5% tariff on a pen, if a member of WTO suddenly raises that tariff to 10%, where it actually had bound at 5%, then it's violating a commitment. And some exporter of pens may take you to, the dispute settlement system. Very simply, it's a court system. I mean, it's not official. Again, my legal colleagues will say you can't call it a court, you can't call people judges, etc. But it's the best way, the easy way to explain it. The two members have an issue over whatever they committed to under WTO. Then they talk first. I mean, there's a whole rule set for that. There's a whole procedure set. They talk first. Can't get out of it through talking, they can take it to the dispute settlement next. And you begin the legal case. And that legal case is looked at by a panel of experts. They choose themselves. They mutually have to agree on the judges, if you want to call them like that. And they come with a ruling. They say, you were right, you were wrong. And, if they accept the ruling, whoever wins or loses, the case is closed. But it means that you have the possibility, and it's a process, it's not just something that's written on one page of an A4. No, it's a whole book, because it explicitly details how you can do it, how long it can take, what you can and what you cannot do, or what principle it has to live up to. It's very carefully done, carefully written. It's used a lot. You mentioned, I think, over 600 cases. It's true. That also means that a lot of people, a lot of members of WTO, do not fully behave according to the rules and disciplines of the organization. But it's always up to the other to prove that. So that's in a nutshell what the dispute settlement system does. Now, I have to add to that, it's a two-tier system. It's based on some of the national systems that we know. You have a case that you started, you lose the case, and you can actually appeal. You can say, I disagree with the ruling, I disagree with the outcome of what that panel tells me to do. So I want to bring it to the next level. That's called the appellate body. And I guess very legal, but it's a possibility to appeal. That appellate body does no longer exist. I mean, this is not the moment to explain why that is a political issue. We no longer have members of this so-called appellate body, so they can't look at cases. So there is a risk right now that some cases that are started, disappear because you and I, again, say we have a case at WTO that comes in front of a panel, and you have criticized me for some policy, I lose, and the panel says you have to change your policy, and I say, no, I'm not going to do it. Then you have the possibility to appeal, or I have the possibility to appeal, depending on what you want. If I do that now, what happens is that it disappears into a void because there's no appellate body, there's no organ that can look at that specific element. So we're missing that. Whether that will be prepared in the future, we hope so. We're working on it, our members are working on it, but it's a very important element. Final point on dispute settlement, it is unique. There's no international organization, as far as I know, that has an internal mechanism that allows its members to take each other to task, if you want to call it. And think of sovereignty there. It's a very interesting thing that they agreed upon at WTO in '95 when they established it. We are allowing some other country to attack my own policies. It was unique, and I remember in the early days when the WTO was criticized for a number of things, the same people that criticized us were also jealous that that kind of dispute settlement mechanism does not exist, still does not exist in the area of environment, or in the area of labor, or in the area of human rights, which, again, tells you something how people look at trade. I'm not telling that it's easy. I'm not telling that people are not questioning this. It's happening right now. Some members don't like it. They signed on to it, but they don't really like it because they don't like the fact that another member can tell them what you're doing is violating your principles you signed on to at the international level. That's it's unique. It has functioned, to an extent still function. We need to have a repair of what was damaged, and I don't know if that's going to work in the short term.
Well, I would hope so, because in a world of global problems, some, and I consider myself there, would argue that national sovereignty, we need a better way to solve problems that are not national and are global. And well, not to open a can of worms, and we can discuss this for hours, but that's quite unique about WTO, and is one of the things that I think is going to surprise most people. The dispute settlement and the way they can enforce, as you said, changes in national policy. Now, Bernie, we have around 10 more minutes. I'd like to open the scope of discussion just a little. As head of external relations, if I remember right, you deal with civil society, basically through NGOs, parliamentarians, and the private sector, right? I wonder who is, nowadays, and we should be discussing sustainability, and climate change. And I'm wondering, of those three of your stakeholders in external relations, who's pushing more, or how do I frame it? Who's taking the lead in putting, quote unquote, pressure on WTO to try to address sustainability within the framework of WTO negotiations? Can you pinpoint any one of those three, or is it a combination? How is this working?
It's more of a combination than in the past. That's the first thing I want to say. When environment, it was used to be called environment, now it's more sustainability, was an issue in the early days of the WTO. It was very much pushed by civil society more than anything else, and some forward-looking governments. Right now, it's very much driven by groups of countries, groups of members of WTO, and certain non-governmental organizations with support, I think that's a big difference from the past. The private sector, there's more and more private sector, companies, company people, leaders of companies that realize, somewhere, somehow we have to deal with this. And there is a link between trade and sustainability, or trade and climate change. So, we have to see what we can do. And most importantly, we have to see which organization, which instrument, and which tool can do what. And I think that's something that was missing in the past. People would focus on one, but not on the other, because they would dismiss them. They say like, oh, you're dealing with this issue, so you have no idea. You probably are only undermining it. And I think there's a reverse logic right now. Hey, wait a minute. If you talk about trade rules, trade disciplines, about trade in general, what can we do to, either avoid that it undermines, climate policies, but more importantly, what can we do to actually make sure that it supports, climate initiatives? And that comes from a mix of people. Parliamentarians is a bit of a different group because they're often at the start of an initiative or a political push, or at the end of an agreement when they have to ratify. And overall, I think they support the idea that in WTO, as well as elsewhere, people talk about sustainability. And again, try to identify what an organization or tool or an instrument can do to help, because everybody realizes it's probably the biggest global geopolitical, the biggest global issue that we face. Add to that a lot of other geopolitical problems that we're having, but climate change, I think there's no one who's not confronted with it on a daily basis.
Sure. And just in closing, one could argue that there's been a bit of a backlash to the whole concept of globalization. There's certain countries that are gone very, nationalistic, Brexit maybe, or what happened in the US. And I know WTO, of course, plays a part in the idea of extending, making the world smaller in a way. This might be more of a personal opinion of yours, but I wonder how you see this quote unquote backlash to globalization, and if it's something that WTO, has present in the way they deal with the countries. What role can WTO play in making sure we don't go backwards in the benefits that, in my humble opinion, has globalization brought to the world?
No, I think it's undeniable that, globalization and growing international relations and openness have led to progress. I can throw in figures like, billion people lived out of poverty, trade had played its role. Developing countries moving forward, trade often plays an important role in creating that progress. But at the same time, I think everybody now realizes and knows better than they did like 15 years ago, because they just didn't have the information, that there's also people that lost out because of that, because of total openness, of total globalization, unfettered expansion without even thinking what it means, particularly at the national level, particularly at the labor level. People lost out, people lost their jobs, people lost their income, companies had to close down. And it's not just in one or the other country. And to an extent, that was because there was competition coming from abroad. There were no restraints or restrictions. So I think what happens right now is like, how can you, what we call it, re-globalize? How can you better use, different economic, islands and areas in the world to support your own, moving forward, rather than just go wherever it's cheapest. You say like, hey, why don't we go to particular? They're good at this, they're good at that. I always use this example. Globalization has been giving the world a lot, but it's also been something that people have become totally dependent on. Anything comes from anywhere at all times. When the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal, one ship, one canal. and I think that the biggest brains in economics said, like, how on earth is it possible that this one blockage led to a complete a partial collapse of value chain? One canal, one ship. How is this possible? It tells you, I think it's the perfect example of like, yes, globalization has its advantages, but it also is very dangerous to depend completely on anything coming from everywhere, because one thing happens and it goes wrong. And I think that's the mindset that's changing right now. People realize, yes, you can't go national. The friendshoring argument, I don't believe it. That's a personal view. I know some of our members do. I think at the end you're going to pay a price because you're going to limit yourself in your choices. And at the end, that's going to hurt your own economic development because your own producers will still need parts, elements, input, support, brain services, whatsoever, to make the same steps. You can't do it all by yourself. I think at the end, you come back to the original theories where you have to be more careful. There's, for example, climate coming back in. How do you do it? How fast do you do it? How controlled do you do it? What systems do you do it? That's what WTO is being confronted with right now. Where do we play a role? How do we play a role? Can we play a role? Should we be more careful? And I think these answers or these questions will be answered. But the fact that there's political realization that it can't just go the way it went is already very healthy.
Sure. I think COVID has also taught us a little bit.
Sorry, obviously, it showed another thing. It also shows how people react. Again, you come to politicians, you can't blame politicians for that, I think. How political systems react if they need to protect their own citizens. They'll do that, and they'll do whatever it takes. And what that leads to is obviously also protectionism, closing of your borders for both imports and exports. And that, of course, hurts economic relations. And there was maybe a very good reason for it. But the gut reaction is always immediate. And the effects are not known yet. And people saw quickly, like, wait a minute. By doing so, other people paid the price. This is where we did play a role. We brought people together. We said, like, you can't do it. You can't just be protectionist here, you know. You have to find a balance between your national interest and your international responsibilities. And a way out can be found. And they did. It took a while.
Sure. That's an interesting concept. Reglobalization. It's very naive to think that we can decouple from the world and all that supply chains are too. One thing that we are seeing on the private sector is this idea of China plus one. Now, many companies just deciding you cannot depend on one country and you have to have several geographies for sourcing and manufacturing. But yeah, it's an ever-changing world, that's for sure.
It's easier said than done. But you know this better than I do. You know, I mean, you're an industry man. I'm an international bureaucrat. I mean, it's easier to say, easier said, like, oh yeah, we just need to diversify. Yeah, but I mean, diversification takes time, costs money, it requires experience, it requires new diplomatic, you know, and economic relations to be developed. It doesn't happen overnight. And even if you try, it may not happen at all.
Yeah, for sure. Bernie, I think it's been fantastic. Thank you so much. I think all our audience has learned a lot of a subject that, as you said, as the ABS on a car, people don't think about it that much until you realize you need it. And we've learned that WTO is something that is a pillar for the way international trade works, and it's only comes to light when certain things happen. But the main focus is to provide, as you said, the stability and the framework for countries to come together and negotiate and agree on things that are very important for their development. I'd like to close with this, which I think is a fun questionnaire, as I mentioned at the beginning, from French journalist Bernard Kuiten. So if I may start, Bernie, what is your favorite word?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. What is your least favorite word?
No.
Okay.
I'm a very straightforward person.
Yeah, you're going in the
Dutch background. I mean,
I know. I was gonna say we're gonna go full Dutch, straight, no BS around it. Okay. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, emotionally?
Well, that's very simple. That's my family, my wife and daughter. They still do that every day.
Wonderful. What turns you off?
It's basically two things, and maybe they're even related. It's arrogance and discrimination.
Okay.
I don't like arrogance. I certainly don't like discrimination.
This one, and I know you speak several languages, you can choose which one to use. I personally would love to hear in Dutch, but please be my guest. What is your favorite curse word?
Well, of course, the politically correct answer is I don't swear.
Oh,
That's not true.
I've heard you, so
I'll give you two because of the multilingual element.
Please.
My favorite English word is wanker. I
okay.
think you use it in so many instances. And then there's a Dutch word. I really hope nobody that speaks Dutch hears this. It's a long word. Godgloeiende, godvergeten boerenkut.
Oh,
If you say that, and I barely ever say it because it's really a bad word, you are very, 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 very angry.
okay,
So
okay. When we finish the taping, I will ask you what it means in detail, but not now. What sound or noise do you love?
This is for the connoisseur, and it shows that I, despite being, very, very responsible, I'm a petrol head. It's the sound of an Alfa Romeo 33 Stradale.
Okay, I'm gonna look for that one too. And what noise or sound do you hate?
Lawnmowers. I hate lawnmowers.
Okay, I guess that has to be as far opposite to the sound of the Alfa Romeo, huh?
It's both are engines, but they're a bit different.
Sure. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
It's one that I already intended, and being a guitar god and a rock artist. I played in a band. If we wanted to become famous, God knows what, didn't really work out.
It's never too late, huh?
Being in a band, playing guitar, yeah.
Okay. And what profession would you never like to do?
I had to think about that one. I think a dentist.
Okay. Okay. I always find these questionnaires so enlightening. Okay, Bernie, and the last one, the very philosophical question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Well, I'm not religious, so I would say like I have no answer, but that would be a bit, say, it's very simple. I want God to tell me you're too early, go back.
Okay, that's great. And go back as a rock star. That makes sense.
Well, that would be, yeah, exactly. Even better. Go back would already be good. You're too early. You have the wrong door, go back.
Sure.
Gain a bit
Bernie,
of extra time.
thank you so much. It's been great talking to you. I think the last time we spoke in person was like 16, 17, no, I'm exaggerating. Yeah, 16 years ago or so. I really have fond memories working with you. Straight shooter, very professional. I'm very glad to catch up. Congratulations on all that you've done in WTO. And let's hope we see the appellate body running again. And maybe, who knows, we can go do another interview in some months about specific negotiations or something. I think it's fun to talk, and I think all the audience benefit from your knowledge. So thank you so much. And let me just thank also Belia Trading for organizing Tradecast. I wish you all a successful day. Goodbye from Latin America. Have a great one.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Belia Trading.